Good morning. It's always a pleasure to be at Portsmouth Abbey and come down the road from Newport. The students here are a little different than what I teach every day. They're about 30 years older than you. I teach adults, usually commanders, captains, colonels in the U.S. military, as well as Department of State people and CIA, and a whole range of individuals. That's what we call the Naval War College. It's not to promote war, it's that we find out how to prevent it, and then if we do go into war, how to win. So those are the kinds of things that I do on a daily basis. This lecture actually comes up because I served in Afghanistan as a civilian advisor in 2009 and then back in 2011 as well. And I was asked to develop counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency doctrine for the United States Army. And my specialty was counter-propaganda. And what I did is, well, I'll show you what I did. I was in information operations in Afghanistan. And what we do is a combination of things. It's called military deception, where you always try to confuse your enemy, what you're doing militarily. And then there's psychological operations, and that's what my specialty was. It was basically countering the Taliban, the enemy's propaganda, and also the Al-Qaeda propaganda in Afghanistan. And that was where I specialized. The other thing is operational security, keeping your troops and your headquarters safe from the enemy. So those are the three things. And they're actually, you can see the pictures down on the bottom left. Here you see a series of troops that are meeting with a local mayor. And if you notice, all of the troops have their uniforms on and their body armor on while we're talking to the local mayor. This was one of the things that I criticized when I was there, because the mayor was about this big. He was a sweetheart of a guy, but what happens when you have a whole bunch of troops walking into the mayor's office to talk to him, you could see him starting to shake. Because we have our weapons with us. So one of the things that we wanted to work on is making us more friendly, at least looking, to people who are on our side. The middle picture is a picture of a radio station that we created up in Nuristan, which is in the far reaches of Afghanistan in the north. It is the poorest section of Afghanistan, very mountainous region. And we didn't have big troop presence, but what we did is we built a radio station and then had locals run the station, because the Taliban, the enemy, believed that music was evil and that stories about Afghan folklore were an abomination to their particular theology. So to prevent that, we promoted the opposite. We had Afghan folk music and stories and bedtime stories for children, and that became a very, very successful counter-propaganda campaign. Then at the bottom, on the right, you see this is how we moved around in Afghanistan in what we call MRAPs. These are up-armored vehicles that cost about $1 million each. And I was very happy to be in those, because if we get hit by a mine, we have a good chance of surviving. But just imagine that driving through the streets of Portsmouth. And you could always go out, anytime you went out, you had to go out in 5 of these in a convoy. And one of the problems that we had in Afghanistan is even when they saw us coming, we felt like we were the enemy rather than friends, because we drove around in those vehicles. And then in the top left, I'm the center, and the guy on the right is a police officer, and the guy on the left is a member of the Afghan army, and those are our allies in that region. So it seems odd, but I began thinking about the American Revolution while I was in Afghanistan, because we were fighting insurgents. Back in 1776, the Americans were the insurgents. So I started thinking about, okay, if I'm an insurgent, I have to get into the enemy's mind, how am I going to operate? How am I going to think? What am I going to try to do? So when I came back to the States, I began writing about the American Revolution as if they were 21st century insurgents. And that's what this lecture is about. Anytime I say something that you don't understand or is a term I use, please don't wait. Just raise your hand and ask me. I like interaction. It's more fun for me to talk with you rather than just talk at you. So please don't hesitate to raise your question. Raise your hand. Okay, this is the information campaign that I developed while I was in Afghanistan that I'm going to use to explain the American Revolution. There are basically 5 components. In order to have a revolt, can you hear me if I'm away from the mic? I have a big mouth, so it's usually not hard to hear from your hearing. You need 5 basic things if you're going to create an insurgency. In fact, my dream is to find some small country that I can become an insurgent and take over the country. That's the kind of thing that I have to think about when I'm running these things. The things you need are, first, you need a message. You need to convince people that you should revolt against the establishment. You should revolt against the government. And in order to develop a good message, you have to have grievances. There has to be something that people are angry about. For the Americans, it's going to be high taxation and no representation. But for other insurgencies that I've studied around the world, most of the time, these insurgencies develop because the country's a mess. The great thing about the American Revolution is the country was working really well for the vast majority of people. So we're the exception rather than the rule. But you need a message. You need to tell people, here's the reason why you want to take up arms. The second thing is, I don't care how good your message is. You need a really effective messenger. I can give you the best message in the world, but unless I'm a believable person, unless you trust me, unless I have the bona fides to exert my leadership, then you're not going to trust me. So you need someone that's charismatic, that people trust, that it also can lead the revolt. And what you're going to see in the American Revolution is we have a tremendous number of people like that. The next thing you're going to need is what I call a medium, a channel of communication. I don't care how good your messenger is. I don't care how good your message is. If I can't get that message out to the people in an effective way, it's not going to resonate. It's not going to go anywhere. And the Americans are incredibly creative about creating these channels of communication, even in the 18th century. Next, you need an organization. Nothing, no political movement works unless you have an organization to translate these ideas into action. In fact, I always tell my students at the War College, you will never understand warfare unless you understand that it's all about politics. You can't separate politics from war for a second, otherwise you don't understand warfare. Because war is the use of violence to achieve a political aim, right? So if you divorce the two, then you don't understand it. And this is very true, particularly for insurgencies, where groups of people are trying to overthrow a government. And finally, if you don't understand your political environment, then you're not going to understand how to win, and you're going to lose. Which means if you're playing a home game, if you're fighting an enemy from outside, you're going to have an innate advantage. The Americans are going to have a tremendous advantage over the Brits because they understand not just the physical terrain, but also the psychological terrain, the way Americans thought back then. So those are the 5 things that we're going to talk about and organize the entire lecture around. Let's start with the message. And here, John Adams, who's my second favorite Adams, I'll tell you about my first favorite later on, is writing after the Revolution. And basically what he said is, we won the war before the first shots were fired at Concord and Lexington. And we won the war because we were able to convince Americans that it was time now to start thinking about the king as not our friend, not as someone that we should obey, but as someone we want to be free from. And it took a long period of time, but that's what happened. So even before Lexington and Concord, what John Adams says is the message and the messengers were there to begin to get people to change their minds about whether or not they should remain British citizens. Think about what you just heard in the presidential election, or any political election that you follow. Politicians have to speak very simply. We call them sound bites. President Obama ran on a campaign called It's Time for a Change. Change we can believe in. Very simple statements, right? Well, the Americans had a sound bite for their own. It's something that we all recognize, right? No taxation without representation. That was the sound bite. So not only do you have to create a message, you have to create a message that people can repeat. It has to be simple. It can't be overly complicated because people will go, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to say here. But if you say no taxation without representation, everybody can understand that. That's why politicians always speak in simple, sound, short phrases so that people can repeat them. Okay, now, here's something that is amazingly true for the American Revolution. And this is where you begin to see the genius of the American founders. They used English political philosophy against the empire. So they built their arguments for the independence of the Americans based on British political and legal principles. Now, there was a very famous British political philosopher who happened to be a member of Parliament during this period of time. His name was Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke, who was a member of Parliament, stands up during the debates and says, people, you've got to understand something. The Americans are using the principles that we created to justify their rebellion. How do we, as British citizens, go to war against people who are defending British rights? This is going to be difficult for us to justify. And the Americans understood that. So a lot of the founders said, look, if we just speak to the British Parliament, to the king, and say, we're not revolting against England, we're trying to protect the very rights that you created. But the problem with that was that the British Empire was the foundation of their wealth and power. And if they let the Americans get away with this, then all of the other colonies would hear this and begin revolting. So King George was the #1 person who was against the Americans, because he feared if this happens, if we give the Americans a break, then everyone else is going to demand it and my empire is going to collapse. And if my empire collapses, then Britain is no longer a great superpower. Look at the messengers. Okay, you've developed a good, simple political message that resonates with people. People can understand it and they agree with it. So what do you need? You need skilled messengers. And look at the individuals who are skilled messengers. This is an amazing group of politicians. You have John Adams, that we've already talked about. And my favorite Adams, Sam Adams. And I'll talk to you about why he was my favorite in a while. Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was the rock star of the 18th century. He was the Drake. He was the whomever you want to call. The star of the day. He was a combination of a scientist, politician, comedian, literary genius, all of these things wrapped up into one. Now think about him being a part of your revolt. John Hancock, an extraordinarily rich man. And remember, if you're going to have a rebellion, you're going to need money to fund that rebellion. Thomas Jefferson, one of the great geniuses of American political history, right? He might have been a hypocrite with slaves, but he had some good ideas. George Washington, an excellent commander, dynamic military leader, and of course Patrick Henry, a great orator. So all of these people were legitimate messengers. People respected them already. So when they came and they talked to people, they automatically had an open reception. These were people that everyone liked and admired. Now, what else do you need? And this is where the interesting part comes. This is where Sam Adams comes into play. Sam Adams is the cousin of John. John gets all the movies and all the popularity, but Sam was the coolest of all. Why? Because you need a firebrand. You need that one guy who's going to go over the edge and start the revolt. He's the guy that's going to organize the rebellion. He's the guy that's going to be the Machiavellian guy in the background, who is going to pull all the strings. He's going to organize the rebellion. He's going to organize the violence. And he's going to do it in an incredibly clever manner. In fact, there are two sides to Sam. On the one side, you have the guy on the right, all dressed up in his nice outfit. He's the intellectual. Okay? Sam Adams actually went to Harvard. He had a BA and an MA. He had an MA in political philosophy and theology. And he wrote his master's thesis on when it is appropriate for a people to rebel against a monarch. This is while he was in college. So this is a guy who's been thinking about this for a while, right? And he writes treatises. He writes these intellectual, political arguments that say, this is the reason why the American colonists are being mistreated, and he quotes Locke and Rousseau and all of the great political philosophers of antiquity to justify the rebellion. So you have the intellectual jump of Sam Adams, right? On the other side, my favorite side of Sam Adams is the Sammy A. Okay? You know the beer, Sam Adams? Well, he was a brewer. He also ran a tavern. Now, if you're going to run and start a rebellion, the best place to do it is where? In a tavern, right? Right? You're going to have lots of young people going there, and they're going to be acting like fools, and that's the best way to convince them to commit violent acts, right? So Sam is going to create this. He's going to recruit groups of individuals to start the rebellion. So you have that two sides, the intellectual, man of letters, and on the other side, the rabid revolutionary. And you need both. And he lies, right? I know politicians never lie, but he did. He accused the Brits of doing everything under the sun. He accused the British soldiers, who were by far and away well-disciplined and very well organized. He accused them of violating the Sabbath by getting drunk on Sundays. He accused them of beating children, of mistreating women. Now, the soldiers didn't do these things for the most part. Every once in a while you might have one soldier, but they were very well disciplined. But Sam didn't care about that. He wanted to start a rebellion. So he would mix truth with falsehoods. Anything he could to rile up the locals to oppose the British. By the way, he would write also lots of articles in local newspapers, but he would never write under his own name. And he would create these wonderful names. My favorite one was Vindex the Avenger. He always used cruel names like that instead of saying it's Sam Adams. And this is how he would do it. Okay, you had skilled messengers. I've got skilled messages, very good messages, but I had to get it out to the people. How do I do that in the 18th century? Well, Americans were the most literate people in the world during this period of time. In fact, we were the most spoiled people in the world, period. Americans actually had more political rights than the average British citizen back in England. Americans were, by per capita, wealthier than the average Brit. We were more literate than the average Brit. And we paid much, much, much lower taxes than the average British citizen. Right? So this is, how do you explain the Americans here? We're like spoiled brats. Right? Mom and dad give you a car, they give you a huge allowance, they never have you do anything at home, and all of a sudden mom and dad goes, I need the car, and now you have to give me 20 hours of work a week. Right? Now, how would you respond to that? Oh, come on. Would you be happy? No, you wouldn't be. Well, that's what the Americans are. The British now are going to start taxing us. So what happens is they get the messages out in the local newspapers, the Boston Gazette. And Sam Adams happens to be good friends with the publishers. And the publishers happen to be pro-revolution. So they let Sam write a lot of the articles. And Sam is going to be doing something that I love. You know what he's going to be doing? He's going to create the violence, he's going to create the disruption, and then he's going to run back to the Boston Gazette and write about it. So think about that combination. I'm not only causing the problems, I'm writing about it and I'm spinning it. I'm spinning it to make sure that the Brits look bad and we look great. It's having your cake and eat it too. And then they're going to create things called the Committees of Correspondence. Right? You might recognize the 18th century version of this guy. Right? Committees of Correspondence are basically letter-writing campaigns. This is a result of the Stamp Act, when the British imposed a tax on anything that's produced, like newspapers or cards or anything that's on paper. And you have to put a tax on it. This really angers the newspaper publishers because they're having to pay taxes. So what happens is Sam Adams, in 1765, organizes a letter-writing campaign. And what he does is he takes about, let's say, 20 of you. You go to somebody's house and you write a series of letters to your friends in Boston, outside of Boston and in other colonies. And what happens is Sammy writes it, and then you write it to Grandma and Cousin Joe and Aunt Sally and other areas. And that gets the information out. So Sam Adams is controlling the message, but it's coming from you guys. And then what happens is, as soon as you've written all these letters, because this is a secret organization, it's a covert act, as soon as you guys have written your 20 letters, you break apart, you don't come back together again. So the Brits don't have any idea what's going on because the committees of correspondence are ad hoc. You make them, you disperse them, you start another one, you disperse them. But what happens is it's getting all that information out very quickly, and the British have no idea. And it's all propaganda because Sam is writing it. And people are going to say, oh, my cousin Joey from Boston is telling me that the Brits are, pillaging and robbing people on the streets. So it's going to prop up the propaganda campaign. It's a brilliant way to get the idea out. Look, they're 18th century bloggers, right? You've all heard of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, right? Well, this is the 18th century version of that. They're getting the information out. And just like Julian Assange, some of it's true and some of it isn't. And who is behind all this? Remember, you had a message, a messenger, you needed to have communication, but you also need an organization. Because this is a political campaign. And the guy who was the campaign manager of the American Revolution, the early stages of the American Revolution, is Sam Adams. And think about how he's controlling this. He has the political wing. He has people who are very well respected in Boston, like Paul Revere, John Adams, James Otis. And those are the people who are not part of the Sons of Liberty. Okay? The Sons of Liberty is the covert, the secret campaign to get independence from the Brits. It is basically what we call it an insurgency organization. He's running an insurgency. He's trying to topple the government. And if I'm going to topple the government, it's going to be a secret organization. So the people that you see in the political wing, they are public personas. They're not part of the Sons of Liberty officially. Why? Because they're respected political leaders. So what they're going to say is, when the violence occurs, while we condemn the violence, we certainly understand it. We would never participate in the violent acts, but we really understand why people are so violent. Because you British are so unfair to us. Right? So they're the nice face. And then you have the communication, the Boston Gazette and others, getting the word out. But here's something that's very important. Any rebellion that requires violence requires one thing: thugs. Simple as that. You need people who are going to beat other people up or even kill other people. And the American Revolution was no different. This wasn't just about politics. This was about, how do I convince the Brits to leave us alone, and they're going to use violence. So you have to recruit thugs. And that's what Sam Adams does. He recruits the military wing. And what does he do? He goes to the local gang leaders. Literally, Boston is filled with gangs. Violent, criminal gangs during this period of time. Now, most people don't understand that. There are two big gangs, the South End gang and the North End gang. The South End gang is my favorite because the guy's name is so cool, Ebenezer McIntosh, right? And then you have Henry Swift on the North End gang. These gangs were huge, 2,000 people, part of this criminal syndicate. Okay, they were the mobsters of the day. And what Sam does is he says, I need my thugs. How do I get thugs? I am going to have a dinner at my tavern, free drinks, and I'm going to have John Hancock, who's really rich, pay for everything. And we're going to invite the North End gang and the South End gang, who hate one another, to dinner and free drinks. Now, if you're a gang member, what are you going to do? Free something? You're going, right? So they go, and they have a wonderful time. Now, the two leaders want to kill each other all the time. And then what Sam does, he sits down with them after a number of drinks and says, instead of fighting one another, why don't you go after the lobsterbacks? Why don't you go after the Brits? And we'll kind of show you where to attack and what to do. And then what Hancock does is he buys them really cool uniforms. So now Swift and McIntosh are all excited because they have new uniforms and they have somebody else they can beat up, and they don't like the Brits anyway. So those are the thugs that are recruited for the rebellion. Oh, today we call it the American Liberation Organization. That's what you call those organizations in the 20th century. Okay, the Sons of Liberty. How many of you guys have studied anything about the Sons of Liberty? Okay, did they ever call them thugs? They're real thugs. Sons of Liberty were the sons of violence. That's what the Brits called them, right? Now, when I was in school, you ever see this picture before on the right? Right here? You ever see that one before? It's in most history textbooks. You seen it? Okay, you must be the history teacher. When I looked at this, as a kid, I looked at it and I said, hey, this is kind of cool. You know, they put the guy in feathers and they're making him drink tea. This sounds like fun. But here's what happens. What they would do is if you were a British tax collector, they would capture you and then they would paint hot tar on your body, about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, that's really hot. They'd strip you down, they'd paint it onto your skin, and while you're writhing in pain, they would take feathers and roll your body in feathers. And then what they would do is they would put you in a cart and drive you through town to humiliate you. This wouldn't kill you, but it would be very painful and incredibly humiliating. And they would do this to the tax collectors, which frankly every March I can understand why they would do that. But it convinced the British that this is going to be very difficult to get taxes. And as a result, a lot of the tax collectors, not just in Boston, but all through the colonies, fled for their lives. And this is precisely what the Americans would do. So this was intimidation. Now remember, John Adams, Sam Adams, these were pillars of the community. They couldn't do that. They had the thugs do it. The Boston Massacre. How many of you have heard of the Boston Massacre? Right? Okay, well, the person who coined that term was Sam Adams, writing about it in the newspaper. And the Boston Massacre is fascinating. The reason it is, it's in March, cold March day, right? Before global warming, where March was kind of nice now. But back then it was really cold. And what happened is, there was a dispute because a poor British soldier wanted a second job. So he goes to a store in the docks and asks for a job. And the American looks at him and says, you know, get out. And they start insulting one another and they get into a fist fight. And as a result, more Americans are coming in. These are guys who work on the dock, longshoremen, people like that. They're tough. And after getting in a fight with the Brits and it's broken up, these guys after work start walking around going, any other Brits we can beat up? So they're looking for a fight. And these sentries who are guarding a warehouse at night are just doing their duty, guarding the warehouse. When the Americans start coming around, there's about 5 or 10 of them at first, and the crowd gets bigger and bigger. And as it gets bigger and bigger, the crowd gets more aggressive. It starts calling them names. Yo mama, kind of things like that, right? And the guards, being good soldiers, stand there and do nothing. But one of the Americans, Edward Garrick, goes right up to the face of the soldier and starts insulting him and starts saying, what are you, kind of a wuss? Why aren't you going to fight me? Come on, fight me. Finally, the guard gets upset and hits him with the butt of his wife. Get away from me. When that happens, then one American runs to the local church, starts ringing the bells. So this is late at night. When you ring church bells late at night, it's not to go to service. You ring church bells late at night in the 18th century, it means fire. And Boston's made of wood. And fire was the most dangerous thing that could happen to Boston. So when that happened, people would come out. They'd come out with buckets of water and blankets. But something else happened. The Americans, instead of coming out with buckets of water, came out with sticks and weapons. And they started throwing things at the soldiers. This was pre-planned. Because, you know the local fire department, you know the volunteer fire department, you heard about that? These are called, and they were the leaders of the local volunteer firemen were called fire wards. And guess who controlled the fire wards? The Sons of Liberty. Sam Adams, all the leaders of the Sons of Liberty had this pre-planned. They were waiting for the right incident so that church bells didn't mean fire. Church bells meant, come out guys, it's time for a fight. It's all pre-planned. And then what happens is the soldiers are overwhelmed with people being aggressive toward them, finally fire a shot, 5 Americans are killed. Sam Adams, who's in the background, runs to the Boston Gazette, and that night writes and calls it the Boston Massacre. It really wasn't the soldiers' fault. It was the Americans being wildly aggressive. But Sam Adams doesn't paint it that way. He paints it as if the Brits are just shooting Americans at will, without any cause. That's how it becomes famous. And then Paul Revere, that picture that you see on the right, Paul Revere makes that. Paul Revere is the artist of the revolution. And this is what I love about Paul. You're going to like it too about this. Not only does he make the art, and he produces lots of it, he sells it for a wonderful profit. How's that for being an American, right? Making a revolution, making money. What more could you want out of life, right? The Boston Tea Party. All heard about the Boston Tea Party? Okay, here's what happened in the Boston Tea Party. They actually send out invitations. It's like they call it a party for nothing. The invitation to the Boston Tea Party is put up all over Boston. In fact, upwards of 5,000 people show up to the docks where the ships of loaded tea are at port. Now remember, the Americans don't want to pay any taxes. And the Brits say, okay, we're going to take all the Stamp Act taxes out, but we're going to keep a tax on tea, just out of principle. And they actually lowered the price of tea, just so that the Americans would buy it because they still had a small tax on it. I mean, the Brits were trying to be reasonable, but the Americans didn't want any part of it. So what happened is Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty began posting all these notes. Come to the Boston Tea Party. Something's going to happen in Boston Harbor tonight. Thousands of people show up. 54 Americans dressed as Mohawk Indians. Really bad Halloween costumes. They didn't look at all like the Mohawks, but it was all a joke. And what happened is they overwhelmed the British sailors and dumped over $3 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor to protest the tax. While this was occurring, one of the British generals sees this and realizes there are too many people for them to stop this riot. So they let them go do it. But as the leaders of the riot are walking by, one of the generals says, watch it guys, you have to pay the Fiddler soon. You're going to get away with it tonight. If something's going to happen, we're not going to let this go through. This is what the British do in response. They call it the Coercive Acts. They said, you Americans are spoiled brats. It's time to punish you. And it's time where the rebellions really start in Boston is we're going to really make you pay for this. We're going to put some pain on you. We're going to close Boston Harbor for shipping. And then we're going to make you quarter British troops in your own homes. And then we're going to take your political rights to vote for local representation. You're going to not have that anymore. It's all going to be British authority. You want to act like spoiled brats? You want to be punks? We're going to treat you like punks. Now the Americans, instead of going, oh boy, we're in trouble, they go, Sam Adams is going, yes, excellent. Yes. Because this is going to make the Americans really angry, and it's going to send a message to the other colonies that look at how oppressive the British are. So he's sending all these messages out about how cruel the British are. What do the British do? Enough's enough, we're going to send the troops. And they send General Gage. And Gage is going to come with troops, a lot of troops, and he's going to say, look, I'm a reasonable man. You give me 2 people, and I'll be happy. You give me John Hancock because he's funding the rebellion, and then you give me Sam Adams because I want to hang that guy. And the Americans go, Sam Adams? I know John, I don't know Sam. Hancock? Never heard of the guy. What does he look like? So they're not giving him up. So Gage begins then to go, okay, you want to be like that? I'm going to start marching. And I'm going to hear, there are caches of weapons that guys, my intelligence says you've hidden, so I'm going to go get them. Concord and Lexington, you all know the story, right? We start firing on the British troops. And then the war really begins in earnest. Now, the Brits are going, oh, jeez, We got a problem. We got a problem in Boston. I'm worried about the other colonies in New York and Virginia particularly. But I'm really worried that Sam Adams and these other guys are going to go to the Canadians, particularly the French Canadians, because the French never really liked the British because they control Canada now, that they're going to start a rebellion up in Canada. So the British go, I need to contain the rebellion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the Quebec Act. And I'm going to say to the Quebecois, the French Canadians, hey, look, I know you got a problem. I know you have a real problem committing your loyalty to the British Anglican Church. We got that. You guys are good Catholics. You don't want to have an oath of loyalty to the Anglican Church. So we're going to say you don't have to do that anymore. You just have to have an oath of loyalty to King George, but not to the Church of England. And by the way, we're going to say we're going to give you parts of North America to colonize for yourself. In fact, we're going to give you Northern Illinois. We're going to give you a whole series of Midwestern states that you can colonize and expand your territory. So this actually worked because the French Canadians stayed loyal to the Brits throughout the war. So it worked. It was a very good policy. On the other hand, it made Americans really angry. And it doesn't say something good about the Americans. The reason they were really angry, most Americans, is because most Americans were Protestants. They didn't like Catholics. I know it's a hard thing to say at Portsmouth Abbey, but back then they didn't like them. So there was a real kind of revulsion against the papists. That's what they called Catholics then. So it made a lot of the people who were running the revolution even more angry, and it was used as propaganda against the British. Also, people like George Washington, Daniel Boone, these were prospectors. They were going out and they were buying land. And they were trying to make money on the land. And a lot of the land was out where the British now gave to the French Canadians. So that angered them even more. You heard them in their pocketbooks, and they were also, into their own prejudices. Okay, now, the Brits weren't a great empire for nothing. These guys aren't fools. And they had their own programs. One was, hey, what's the real weakness? What's the real weakness of the Americans? They have something that a lot of problems can be caused by. They have slavery. So if I am going to disrupt these American revolutionaries, particularly the wealthy ones who own slaves, Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia, says any slave that joins the British Army now will be free after the war. Now, George Washington owned hundreds of slaves. This scared the Americans in the South a lot. And it was supposed to. They were saying, look, you loyalists, if you're loyal to the crown, your slaves stay your slaves. But if you're going to rebel against the crown, your slaves can join our army and get freedom later on. But what happened is the loyalists who owned slaves said, oh, wow, once their slaves get freedom, my slaves are going to want the same thing. So it actually hurt the British cause. It made a lot of sense. It was a weakness, a major evil and vulnerability among the Americans to go after the slaves, but in many ways it backfired and made it more anti-British in the South. Still a good policy. Now, George Washington. You all heard about wonderful George Washington, what a great general he was. He was a great general. But at the beginning, how do I say this nicely? He really, I don't know how to say it nicely. He wasn't good. I don't want to use a term I really want to use, but he really messed up. He really screwed up because the British are known for what? Their great Navy. And they had a great Marine Corps. So they had amphibious landings. So George Washington decides, I'm going to take the greatest British Navy and the greatest Expeditionary Force Army. I'm going to take them on Long Island. And what happened is George put all his troops in Long Island and the British circled it, called an envelopment movement, and beat the living heck out of them. And George Washington only got away through a series of luck, fog, bad weather, and pre-planning with some boats so they could get away under the cover of night and fog. But we nearly lost the American Revolution in that one battle at the outset of the war. And the leader, General Howe of the British, said, now that we've defeated you militarily, we're going to offer amnesty. So anyone who says, hey, look, now we beat you down, but if you want to remain loyal to the crown, we'll forgive you. Even if you took up arms against us, we'll forgive you. We'll give you amnesty. It was a brilliant 1-2 combination of iron fist and velvet glove. And New York, as a result, remained in British hands until the very end of the war. And here's, as the war goes on, one of their great generals, Clinton, says, I'm going to translate 18th century into 21st century. Basically what he says is, in order to control a country that I want to take over, I have to use violence. The more violence I use, the more I make people angry at us. So the long run, it makes me much more difficult to control them if I use violence. And that's the same problem that we see today. If we're fighting insurgents in countries and we have to use violence against them, in many ways it does as much harm as it does good. Okay, the Declaration of Independence, the greatest propaganda campaign in the history of this country. Propaganda, remember, is just the use of information to persuade. Truth is usually a very good way to do that, too. And the Declaration of Independence is written for a wide array of audiences. Anything from local Americans. In fact, when they write it, when Thomas Jefferson writes it, he has little side notes. He says, look, emphasize this point. Say this loudly. Pause here for effect. Because he knew that the Declaration of Independence was going to be printed, and then what happened is most people came to the local town square or the tavern and read the Declaration of Independence. So it was to convince Americans, but it was also to convince the rest of the world that it was a legitimate rebellion. So the first part of the Declaration of Independence talks about all of the atrocities committed by the king to justify the rebellion. Then the loyalists say, hey, look, this Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal. How do you deal with slavery then? They were pointing out at the very outset the hypocrisy of American founders. Now, my second favorite guy, my first favorite guy is Sam Adams. My second favorite is Ben Franklin. Why? Because he's totally cool. And I say that because he's in his 70s when he goes to Paris. And his job is to convince the French to help us in the war. And it's very difficult because if you're going to have an insurgency, you need outside help, military and economic help. So he's going to convince a king, the King of France, to help a rebellion against the King of England. Now, even though the French and the British don't like one another, how do you convince a king to help people rebel against another king? It might not work out very well. By the way, it's not going to work out very well for the French later on anyway. So only Franklin can do it. And literally, he is such a rock star that people pay other people to wait in line so that they can get a good place to watch Ben Franklin as he drives by in his carriage. Okay, so this is a super pop star in Paris. In fact, if you were going to have a party and Ben Franklin wasn't in your party, at your party, then your party was like, really not worth going to. That's how popular he was. And he played it up. He was a wonderful actor. This is what he said. He's writing home to his wife. And he says, figure me in your mind as jolly as formerly, very plainly dressed, wearing my thin gray hair straight out that peeps from under my hat. A fine fur cap which comes down to my forehead, almost to my spectacles. Think how this must appear among the powdered heads of Paris. Okay, remember they all wore wigs if you were part of the elite in Parisian society. And what he did is, Ben Franklin grew up in Boston and lived in Philadelphia. He was a city boy. The only time he went into the country was when he traveled from Boston to Philadelphia, right? But he dressed like he was a backwoodsman because the French thought that was cool. They thought it was really neat to see someone who was a frontiersman but who was incredibly smart. So he played up this whole thing. And in order to do that, what he did is he got himself invited to the parties because this backwoodsman couldn't get invited to see the king right away. So he had to then ingratiate himself to the wealthy Parisians so that he could make his way up the political ladder. And that's precisely what Ben Franklin does. And as a result, he eventually convinces Vergennes, who's the foreign minister, to get the French to supply the Americans with money and troops. He also recruits Lafayette and von Steuben, who are generals who help the American cause. Tom Paine. If you guys haven't written or read anything about Thomas Paine, Common Sense, do yourself a favor. It's short and it's beautiful. Because what he does is he writes for the common people. And he's writing about, he uses the Bible, he uses nature as a way to convince people that, look, I know the war's not going well for the Americans, but this is a good time to buck up and stay with the cause. In fact, this was so effective that George Washington had it read to his troops on a nightly basis at Valley Forge during the American Revolution. Okay, last thing, then we'll take questions. You all heard about Trenton and Princeton. This is after Washington loses, big time. I mean, he gets wiped out by the British in Long Island. He's going to figure out a way to convince the American people that the troops are still a viable force. So what he does is he picks 2 remote outposts that don't have too many British soldiers, and he hits them at Christmas time. This is my favorite. America, we will kill you in your sleep on Christmas. This is a brilliant way of doing things because Washington has to convince the Americans we still have a chance. So this was a small victory that made people forget about a huge defeat in Long Island. Conclusions. We won. They lost. Why? Why did we win? Why did they lose? Because we created a foundation, a political foundation, a political campaign that kept us through the tough times during the war. And it was those principles that people kept coming back to justify the rebellion. With that, I'd be happy to take your questions. I hope you learned something. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer is you attack the enemy's strategy. So the American strategy was, okay, how do I justify the rebellion? No taxation without representation. So what could the Brits have done? And think about it. If I'm the British and I want to stop this rebellion, all I can say is, okay, give me 13 representatives, send them to England. Now shut up and pay your taxes. Think about that. Poor Sam Adams was really afraid of that. Right? Because what happens to my soundbite? Okay, no taxation with representation? You know, how do you do that? So if you attack the enemy's, political platform immediately, before it begins to, resonate with lots and lots of people, then that might have helped. And remember, there are almost 200 members of Parliament, so 13 more people from the colonies. That wouldn't have been anything. In fact, it would have been smart for the king, because then people would have said, wow, look what the king's doing. It's giving us representation. They would probably have been more loyal to the king. So that's one of the things. The problem with that is, if you're the Americans, and you're using British political philosophy to justify the rebellion, it's easy to compromise. If, on the other hand, it's a depraved theology like Islamic State, who are really scary. And in fact, one of the things I was going to talking about a couple months ago was the Islamic State, that I figured I would depress the living heck out of you guys, so we won't talk about it. It's hard to compromise with them, because they don't believe in compromise. So it's a lot easier to compromise politically. Think about it. I can compromise on politics. I can't compromise on my religion. And that's what makes it much more difficult today than it was in the past. That was a great question. What should South Korea do with North Korea? Yeah. Wow. Easy question. Pray. That's always good. Gosh. Okay. Here's something. For those of you who don't know a lot about North Korea is led by one of the worst regimes in the entire world. By saying that, that says a lot. And what North Korea does is it's an extraordinarily poor country because it shut itself off from the rest of the world. But in order to justify their oppression of their people, what they did is they put all their money into their army and into building nuclear weapons. So they are a very, very poor country that's led by a very harsh dictator who justifies the military spending because he says everyone wants to attack us. So what he has done over the last 20 years is he's blackmailed the rest of the world. And he said, I will build a bomb unless you give me foreign aid. We gave him foreign aid, he built the bomb. He lied. So periodically what happens is, he says, you know what, I'm going to build a missile system, and I'm going to build a missile to hit California. That's what he's saying right now. What he's doing is negotiating. He's trying to blackmail. And he's been blackmailing the West for many, many years. And you usually hear about blackmail, oh, you should never succumb to blackmail. But in fact, it's worked. The more, if you give the North Koreans some foreign aid, then they shut up for a little while. And then when they need more foreign aid, they'll do the same kind of blackmail. Now, it sounds insane, but sometimes paying people off is not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. I know that's a horrible answer, but the only other alternative is to go in there and actually hit their nuclear program. But their nuclear program, their nuclear missiles, are buried deep, deep under the ground in hardened silos, concrete, many, many feet deep and thick. So in order to knock their nukes out, you'd have to have a direct attack, or direct hit, and you'd be able to do that, but they'd be massive, massive bombs. And that would be a very dangerous thing. And then you've got to be sure you knock them all out. So sometimes it's better to give in than to actually go to war. Now, I know that's a hard thing to say, but I would rather do that than actually go to war. For the South Koreans, you have to have a strong relationship with the West, with Americans, and with Japan to hope to deter the North from doing anything crazy. But this is a difficult situation. And South Korea is a beautiful country. I've been there many times. And it's hard to say what I just said, but the only alternative is war. Sir?
Is there no chance for insurgency in North Korea then?
Oh, that's a great question. Is there no chance for an insurgency in North Korea? Not much of one. And the reason is it's a police state. So you have a country that is dominated by the military and dominated by spies within the country who are always watching what you're doing, okay? So if you think your parents are a pain, you should see what they do in North Korea. They literally separate you from your parents at a young age. They indoctrinate you into this harsh communist ideology. And then you are told, you spy on you, you spy on him, you spy on everyone else. And you are rewarded if you can tell bad things about your classmates. Right? So as a result, people are so afraid to rise up that the chance of an insurgency in North Korea is very, very remote. Good question. Well, you know what? A lot of people would say the Sons of Liberty committed terrorist acts. Right? I mean, if I'm tarring and feathering people, that's not exactly warm and cuddly. Right? But there are degrees of it. War always has these violent acts. The difference is the Americans tried to limit harm to non-combatants, to civilians. The Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and other groups like that intentionally aim at civilian populations. Because they're not strong militarily, what they do is they aim at civilians to cause terror. That's why we call it terrorism. And that is to try to convince people that they can't support the government because they're too afraid. Now, the Islamic State, there are some groups, I hate to say this at a school like this, there are some people who just need to be killed. I know that sounds horrible. I know it does, it really does. I'm sorry. I know you'll never have me back. Confession on Sunday, okay? But there are some people who are so innately evil. Look, I mean, I have been to every real horrible place in the world, and one of the things that I am most convinced of is that there really is evil in the world. There really are evil, evil people. And the leader of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is a truly evil man. And the kinds of things, I'm not even going to go through some of the things that the Islamic State does to innocent individuals. But there are some people that you can't compromise with, that you must actually defend yourself. And remember, Catholic doctrine says that. Just war theory, if you ever study that, gives Aquinas and Augustine talk about when is it justified to actually commit acts of violence. And it's justified in self-defense. And here the Islamic State has committed acts of horrendous warfare on not just people locally, but they're spreading into Europe and elsewhere. And the only way to really combat people like that is to take them out. I know that sounds horrible, but that's why you have a military. And that's the reality of the situation. I wish the world wasn't like that. I wish there were more Gandhis than there are Abu Bakr Baghdadis. But in reality, there are too many of those and not enough Gandhis. Did I answer your question? I know I depressed myself, so I'm sure I depressed a couple of people. The question is, for those of you who haven't heard it, what happened with Assad in Syria and the Arab Spring, which started several years ago, which was so optimistic. I mean, people were rising up against dictators in the Arab world, and it was mostly a peaceful uprising. And then all of a sudden, it turned around. Do you want to?
Yeah, the president said most of it, what happened in Syria that made it so violent?
Okay, what happened in Syria that made it so violent? The answer to that is very simple. An evil man. Assad. Assad is the leader of Syria, and when he saw his people rising up against him, he said, I have a couple of choices. I can compromise with them, I can try to bring them in the fold, I can reason with people, or I could step down, or I could kill them. He decided to kill them by the hundreds of thousands. What you're seeing, one of the worst genocidal acts in the 21st century happening right now in Syria. What happened here is Assad was a very, very clever man. You can be evil and clever at the same time. And Assad said at the beginning of this uprising, look, these people aren't rebelling against me. These people are terrorists. But Al-Qaeda has infiltrated them, or the Islamic State has infiltrated those groups. So I'm not going to compromise with them. I'm just going to kill them. And it's a very complicated situation in Syria, because Assad is a member of the Alawite community, which is an offshoot of Shia. But most Syrians are not Shia, they're Sunni. Okay, so there's a religious tension in that country. And what Assad said is, if I let some people rise up against me, since I'm a minority in my community, I'm going to have to kill these people to make sure they don't rise up against me, which is, by the way, what his dad did a couple of decades ago. So he has precedent for that. And what happened as a result of that is that the country now has imploded. And you have a lot of problems with refugees, people fleeing Syria because they don't want to be killed. You have a whole series of difficulties there. And what made it worse was the Russians became involved. It's a very complicated situation. President Obama said, hey, look, Assad, if you use chemical weapons against your own people, we're going to have to punish you severely. And then Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. It's a horrific human being. And then what happened is, okay, Obama said, now you're going to punish you. But instead of doing that, he said, okay, we can negotiate. And he allowed Putin to become part of the negotiations. Putin is the leader of Russia. And what happened is he said, okay, we're going to get the chemical weapons out. And Assad, knowing that you don't want the Americans to bomb us, he said, okay, we'll let some of our chemical weapons out. But what happened is, when the chemical weapons agreement came out, and they took the chemical weapons out, some of them, not all of them, by the way, he's used it again, the Russians became involved in Syria even more. And they built air bases, they put a lot of the Navy in there, they put their special forces in there, and now they're bombing. The Russians are actually bombing the Syrians, and they're using things called cluster bombs. And cluster bombs are anti-personnel bombs. And they're a bomb, and then it's got little bomblets in it. And they're literally bombing cities to kill as many people as they can. It's indiscriminate bombing, it's horrific. And this is the problem that we're trying to deal with now. And unfortunately, the international community is not doing enough. If you can say your prayers for the poor Syrian people. I need them. Thank you.